The first thing Sira noticed about the Vekari king was not his crown, a lattice of living bone that pulsed with bioluminescent current along its ridges, but the ring on his foreclaw. It was her mother's ring, Luna silver, hammered thin as a moth's wing, set with a single stone of frozen starlight that the deep-sea miners of Callisto called a lunacite. There was exactly one ring like it in the known galaxy, because her mother had fashioned it herself from ore she'd sieved out of the ice with her own 2 hands, back when the mining colony was new, and the sky above it was still clean enough to see the moon it was named for. Her mother had given that ring to Sira's father on the day they bonded. Her father had worn it until the day he died. Then Sira had worn it, stitched into the inside of her glove, pressed against her palm during every shift in the subcrust tunnels, a small warm secret she kept between herself and the people she had lost. She had not noticed it was gone until she saw it on the Vekari king's claw, held up to the light in the diplomatic gallery, while he turned it admiringly, and a woman in silk, his first consort, or rather the human woman who had been elevated to that role, leaned close and whispered something that made him exhale smoke through his gill slits in what passed among Vekari for laughter. The woman was Myrla Voss. Sira had known her for 11 years. She did not react. That was the first test of who she was going to be in the next few minutes. She stood very still in the service corridor behind the lattice screen that separated the workers from the diplomats, her tools in her hand, her uniform the gray of a tunnel rat, and she watched the king turn her mother's ring in the light, and she breathed slowly through her nose the way her father had taught her, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and she did not move. There were 3 Vekari honor guards between her and the door. There were 40 human technicians in this gallery alone, all of them contracted to the Vekari sovereign authority under the Concordat Treaty, which meant they were legally guests, which meant they were legally hostages, which meant none of them could afford for Sira to do what every single muscle in her body was currently instructing her to do. She put her tools down, very quietly on the shelf beside her. She picked up her tablet. She walked away. The tunnel ran for 412 kilometers beneath the floor of the Vekari Reach, bored through dense igneous rock by machines that the Vekari had designed and humans had built, because that was the arrangement. Vekari provided the capital and the vision. Humanity provided the labor and the ingenuity to make the vision real. The Concordat had framed it as a partnership. Everyone who actually worked the tunnel called it what it was, a lease on breathing rights. Sira's official title was Senior Integration Engineer, which meant she was the human the Vekari tunnel supervisors yelled at when something the Vekari had designed failed to interface with something the humans had built. She had spent 3 years in the subcrust bore, learning the tunnel's moods the way a sailor learns a sea, its pressure variations, its thermal pockets, its tendency to shift in the deep middle sections where the rock composition changed, and the drill heads had to be recalibrated by feel rather than by spec. She knew this structure. She knew it the way she had known her father's voice, or her mother's hands, not as information but as something closer to the body. She was standing in Junction 47, running a stress analysis on a load-bearing segment that had been vibrating slightly off-spec for 2 shifts, when her second came to find her. Davy Orsino had been working the tunnel for 6 years, which made him ancient by the standards of the Boer crew. He was small and wiry, with the careful economy of movement that long tunnel shifts bred into people, and he had a habit of arriving at Sira's elbow with information that no one had asked him to gather. "Heard you were in the diplomatic gallery this morning," he said. "I was fixing the ventilation relay on sub-level C. The gallery is adjacent." "And you saw the king?" "I saw the king." Davy was quiet for a moment, examining the readout she was holding with more focus than the readout strictly warranted. "And the woman with him, Voss?" Sira looked at the stress analysis. One of the load numbers was drifting again, fractionally, the way a compass drifts near a magnetic anomaly. You had to watch it for a while to understand the pattern. She gave him the ring, Sira said. My ring. She stole it from my gear locker and she gave it to him, as a tribute gift. That's what they do. The humans in his court give him things, artifacts, curios, human objects. It raises their status. The rarer the thing, the higher they climb. And Voss climbed. She's his first consort now, or something adjacent to it. She wears a Vekari secondary bond clasp on her collar. Sira set down the tablet. She's been planning this for a long time. Davy let the silence stretch. He was good at that. What are you going to do? He finally said. Sira picked the tablet back up. I'm going to find out why this segment is vibrating, she said. Then I'm going to figure out the rest. What most people understood about the Vekari was their size, their longevity, their bioluminescent hierarchies that shifted color with mood and rank. What most people didn't understand, what the Concordat's public relations materials were very careful never to explain, was that Vekari society was built on a concept with no clean human translation, which the xenolinguists had rendered as the unbroken accord. The accord was not merely a treaty. It was a living document, renegotiated constantly through gesture and gift and the specific social grammar of Vekari exchange. When the king accepted a gift, he was not simply receiving a pleasant thing. He was acknowledging a relationship, a chain of obligation that ran in both directions. The gift giver gained status. The king gained acclaim. When Meyer Lavas had given him Sira's mother's ring, she had gained herself a position in his court. But she had also, under Vekari law, given him a claim on whatever the ring represented. In Vekari tradition, a bonding ring represented the lineage of the family that made it. Ownership of the ring was not merely symbolic. It was, if the king chose to invoke it, a formal declaration of custodial rights over the human family whose blood the ring carried. Sira had spent a great deal of time in the tunnel's deep maintenance archives, which contained, among other things, a complete library of Vekari contract law that no one had ever bothered to restrict worker access to. Because who in the subcrust bore was going to read Vekari contract law? She had read all of it. She understood now exactly what Meyer Lavas had done, and she understood exactly how to undo it. The tunnel had a problem that nobody in the Vekari Authority wanted to talk about. It had been built brilliantly, at enormous cost, by human hands guided by Vekari specifications, to connect the two largest population centers in the reach across terrain that surface transit could not cross efficiently. The vision was flawless. The engineering was, in several specific respects that Sira had catalogued over 3 years, not quite right. The Vekari designed from principle. They thought in grand unified theories, in elegant mathematical frameworks that described how matter should behave. They were extraordinary at the large scale. They were less attentive to what happened at the seams, the places where one material met another, where one system handed off to the next, where the elegant framework met the messy reality of igneous rock and hydrothermal variation, and the thousand small rebellions of a structure that was, no matter how well planned, being carved through the living guts of a planet. The seams were where Sira lived. She had spent 3 years mapping them. She had found, in the deep central section of the tunnel, a sequence of stress accumulations that the Vekari supervisor's monitoring systems were not reading correctly. The systems were calibrated to Vekari tolerances. The tunnel had been built by human hands to Vekari plans, and the seams between those two realities had developed, over time, a specific pattern of microfracture that the Vekari instruments were not designed to see. She had filed 7 reports. They had been received by the Vekari Tunnel Authority with the particular quality of stillness that meant the recipient was choosing not to understand. She had the data, all of it. She had been storing it methodically in a partition of the maintenance archive that was technically accessible to the sovereign authority, but that no one had actually opened in 8 months because it was labeled, in Vekari script, as Legacy Drillhead Calibration Record Sub-Series 4. It was not, in fact, Legacy Drillhead Calibration Record Sub-Series 4. She needed 3 things. The first was access to the Diplomatic Protocol Archive, which contained the procedural code for how a human could, under Vekari law, formally contest a gift transfer and reclaim an object of lineage significance. The process was obscure. It had been used twice in the history of the Concordat, both times by Vekari nobles contesting gifts among themselves. No human had ever invoked it. The process required the petitioner to present themselves before the sovereign in a formal audience of reclamation, demonstrate the lineage claim, and make the case for return. If the sovereign declined, the matter was closed. If the sovereign accepted, or if the petitioner could demonstrate that the original gift had been made under false pretense, specifically that the giver had no rightful claim to the object being gifted, the transfer was void. The giver was stripped of any status gained from it, and the petitioner stood in the giver's place in terms of the sovereign's obligation. In other words, if Sira could prove that Myrla Voss had stolen the ring, Voss lost everything she'd gained, and Sira stood where Voss had been standing. She did not particularly want to stand in Voss's place in the Vekari court, but she wanted her mother's ring back, and she wanted the sovereign to be looking at her, not Voss, when she told him what she knew about his tunnel. The second thing she needed was a witness to the theft. Under Vekari evidentiary protocol, a lineage claim required either a sworn testimony of the original bond ceremony or a witness who could attest to the petitioner's possession of the object within the prior cycle. Davy, it turned out, had seen Myrla Voss come out of the gear locker bay on the morning in question. He had not known what she'd taken. He had thought it was odd. Voss was administrative. She had no business in the gear locker bay, and he had noted the time and said nothing because in the tunnel you said nothing about anything until you understood what it meant. Davy, it also turned out, had a very good memory for the time. The third thing Sira needed was leverage. Not for herself. The audience of reclamation was a formal process, and the moment she started making the case look like a transaction, it would collapse. The leverage was for afterward, for the moment when the formality was concluded, and she was standing in the king's presence, not as a petitioner but as a senior integration engineer who had been trying to tell someone in authority that his tunnel had a problem. She was going to bring the data, all of it, and she was going to lay it in front of a sovereign who had spent years surrounded by humans whose entire strategy was to give him things that made him feel powerful, and she was going to give him, instead, the most useful thing anyone had offered him since the tunnel broke ground. The truth. Getting an audience with the sovereign of the Vekari Reach was, under normal circumstances, a 6-month diplomatic process mediated by 3 layers of administrative staff and a formal petition process that required sponsorship from an existing court member. Under the Vekari Concordat's appendix on lineage reclamation, however, a petitioner with a valid lineage claim had the right to request an expedited audience within a single administrative cycle, to be granted within 3 standard days. Sira submitted the petition at 600. By 900, a Vekari court functionary, slim, pale carapaced, emanating the faint gold luminescence of minor authority, appeared at the junction where Sira was running her stress analysis, and informed her, in careful Concordat standard speech, that her petition had been logged, and that she was to appear before the sovereign at the 3rd hour of the following day. The functionary left without asking any questions. Sira went back to her stress analysis. The segment was still vibrating. She noted the new data. The pattern was becoming clearer. Davy found her that evening in the deep maintenance section, where she had spent 4 hours pulling physical tap readings from the microfracture monitors she'd installed in the load-bearing segments without authorization 18 months ago, because the authorized monitors weren't picking up what she was picking up, and she needed to know. "You're not sleeping," he said. I'm working. Those are the same thing to you and they're not. He sat down on a crate of drill head components and watched her work. I've been thinking about tomorrow. Don't overthink it. I've been thinking about what happens after. He paused. If it goes the way you think it will go, if the sovereign strips Voss of her position and you end up standing where she was, that puts you in the court. That puts you in his orbit. The Vekari don't release people from that orbit easily. Sierra pulled a data cable and checked the reading at the end of it. The microfracture depth was 3 millimeters deeper than her last reading, taken 6 weeks ago. I know, she said. And the data you're planning to give him, if you're right about the structural risk. I'm right. Then you're handing him a crisis. Sovereigns who are handed crises sometimes look for someone to blame. I know that too. Davy was quiet. She could hear the tunnel breathing around them, the deep subsonic thrum of pressurized rock, the tick and settle of the bore infrastructure, the faint mechanical heartbeat of the ventilation system that she had designed and overseen the installation of, and that now ran so smoothly that the Vekari supervisors had stopped acknowledging it existed. My father worked a mine for 30 years, she said. The whole time he was down there, management was filing reports that said the infrastructure was sound. He filed 3 reports of his own saying it wasn't. They were received. She pulled another cable, checked another reading. He was in section 14 when it failed. Davy said nothing. I survived because I was in section 9 that shift. I was 17. I spent 4 months in that mine after, helping with the search and the reconstruction, and I learned 2 things. First, the structure always tells you what's wrong if you know how to listen. Second, the people who should be listening are very good at choosing not to hear. She stood up, gathering the data cables into a coil. The Vekari King is going to hear me tomorrow. He doesn't have a choice about that because I have a legitimate petition and he has a procedural obligation under his own law. Once I'm in that room, I'm going to make sure the second thing he hears, after whatever he decides about the ring, is what his tunnel has been trying to tell him for 3 years. And if he still doesn't listen, she looked at him, then I'll find another way. But I don't think he won't listen. I think he hasn't been told. She paused. There's a difference between a king who chooses not to hear and a king who has been kept from hearing. I think Wolf, the people in his court who benefit from things staying as they are, I think they've been very careful about what reaches him. Davy considered this. You think Voss was part of that? I think Voss was a useful tool for people who had larger interests. She got what she wanted: position, proximity to power. They got what they wanted, which was another layer of distraction around the sovereign. More gifts, more courtly performance, more elaborate ritual of tribute that keeps everyone's attention on the social hierarchy and off the load-bearing infrastructure. Sierra tucked the data cables under her arm. But tomorrow I'm going to be the distraction, and I'm going to make it count. She dressed for the audience the way her mother had taught her to approach a difficult thing, cleanly, practically, without ornamentation that she couldn't afford to lose. Her uniform was pressed. Her tools were not on her belt. Court protocol prohibited equipment in the sovereign's presence. But her tablet was, and she had loaded onto it everything she had, organized not for human reading, but in the hierarchical data lattice format that Vekari administrative records used, because she had learned that format in the archives, and she wanted the king to be able to read her data the way he read his own. Davy walked with her to the diplomatic corridor. He stopped at the threshold. In for 4, he said. She looked at him. You said your father taught you. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He did. Good technique. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the kind of gesture that meant everything in a place where people didn't make gestures lightly. Go get your ring. The sovereign audience chamber was carved from the native rock of the Reach, not built. The Vekari had a philosophy about enclosed spaces. that they should be continuous with the earth that surrounded them, not imposed upon it. The walls were unsmoothed, the stones' natural veining running through them in patterns that caught the bioluminescent light of the sovereign's court and scattered it in colors that shifted as the assembled Vekari breathed and moved. There were 12 of them in the chamber besides the sovereign himself. 3 were honor guards, posted in postures of formal stillness at intervals around the room. The others were court members, some human, some Vekari, positioned with the careful spatial grammar of Vekari status. Meyer Lavas stood to the king's left, 3 paces back, in a position that indicated secondary bond. She was wearing a gown the color of deep water, and she wore the Vekari secondary bond clasp at her collar. And when Sira walked in, she went very still in a way that the other humans in the room probably read as composed, and that Sira, who had known her for 11 years, recognized as fear. The king himself was larger than she had expected. She had seen him through the latticed screen at distance. Up close, his scale was different. He stood, the Vekari did not use thrones, considering them a human affectation at the chamber's center, and his carapace was the dark iridescent blue of deep authority, shot through with the gold of sovereign luminescence. He was watching her with the compound patience of a creature that had lived 400 years and expected to live 400 more. On his foreclaw, catching the scattered light, her mother's ring. Sira pressed her fingertips together, a gesture the Vekari used to indicate sincere greeting between near equals, which was slightly above her station and slightly below his, and exactly calculated to telegraph that she knew the protocol and had chosen to use it deliberately. Something shifted very slightly in the sovereign's luminescence, not displeasure, attention. She spoke in Vekari formal register, which she had spent 2 years learning from the archive recordings, because the diplomatic translators always softened things, and she wanted nothing softened. Sovereign, I come before you under the provision of Concordat Appendix 7, the Lineage Reclamation Protocol, to contest a gift transfer made to your court within the last administrative cycle. The object in question is the lunar silver bonding ring currently on your foreclaw, which I identify as the lineage object of the family Allen, transmitted through the bond of my parents, held by me from the time of my father's death, until it was removed from my custody without my knowledge or consent by an individual who had no rightful claim to it. Her voice was level, she had practiced level. The king turned his foreclaw slightly, looking at the ring. His court was utterly silent. The giver had no claim, he said. His Concordat standard was excellent, precise, without the softening the translators used. No claim under your law or mine. I have a witness who can attest to my possession of the ring within the prior cycle, and I have documentation of the bond ceremony in which it was made. She had found the ceremony records in the Callisto Colony Archive, digitized, public domain. She had them on her tablet. If you require the formal evidentiary process, I am prepared to provide it. If you accept the attestation of possession as sufficient, I am prepared to proceed directly to reclamation. The king looked at Meyer Lavas. Voss had gone from very still to the particular quality of stillness that meant she was deciding whether to speak, and concluding that she could not afford to. She had not prepared for this. She had understood the gift as a social transaction. Give the king something rare, gain something in return without understanding, because she had not read the archive, because she had not spent 2 years in the Vekari contract law sections, because she had been too busy constructing her position to understand what the position was built on, that the Vekari sovereign's gift acceptance was also a claim acknowledgement. She had given him something she didn't own. Under his own law, that invalidated not only the gift but everything she'd gained from it. The king looked at Sira. "Present your witness," he said. Davi's testimony was brief and precise. Date, time, location, description of observed behavior. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He stated what he had seen in the flat, practical manner of someone who had spent 6 years in the subcrust bore, where the only thing that mattered was what was actually true, and then he was done. The king listened without moving. His court members were doing the careful Vekari equivalent of looking at their feet. When Davy finished, the king was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached up and removed the ring from his foreclaw. He held it out towards Sira, held between two foreclaw points with a precision that was, she understood, the Vekari gesture for returning something that was never rightfully held. She crossed the chamber. She held out her hand. He placed the ring in her palm. The Luna-Silver was warm from his body heat. The frozen starlight of the lunacite caught the bioluminescent glow of the chamber and scattered it into a pattern that looked, briefly, like the moon the mine had been named for. She closed her fingers around it. "The claim is void," the king said, and his voice carried the particular resonant quality that indicated a formal declaration. "The status conferred by the transfer is rescinded. The giver held no right of transfer." Meyer Lavas left the chamber. Sira did not watch her go. She was watching the king. "There is a second matter," she said. The court shifted. Several of the Vekari exchanged glances, the rapid microluminescent flicker that was their equivalent of a raised eyebrow. A human supplicant who had received what she came for, and then kept talking, was not a thing that happened in the sovereign's chamber. "The tunnel has a problem," Sira said. "I have been documenting it for 3 years. I have filed 7 reports that were received and not acted upon. I would like to show you the data." She held up her tablet. The king looked at the tablet. He looked at Sira. He looked at the tablet again. "Show me," he said. She had organized the data for a Vekari reader, and she walked him through it the way she walked through a bore section she'd mapped 100 times, not rushing, not performing, just pointing at what was there and letting it speak. The microfracture data came first. The pattern was visible even on the tablet's small screen. A sequence of stress accumulations in the deep central section, growing over time, deepest at the seams where Vekari design met human construction, and the two vocabularies of structural tolerance had been translated between each other without quite enough precision. The vibration data came next. The load-bearing segment in junction 47 was the most visible symptom, but it was not the cause. It was downstream of the central accumulation, receiving stress that the rock was redistributing through pathways the official monitoring system wasn't reading. Then the projection data, which was the part she had spent the most time on, because projections were the thing that either made someone understand a slow-moving crisis or gave them permission to dismiss it. The projection was conservative. She had used the most optimistic parameters she could honestly use. Even with those parameters, the central accumulation would reach critical stress threshold in approximately 14 months. The tunnel would not collapse all at once. That was not how this kind of failure worked. It would fail in sequence, beginning at the deepest seam and propagating outward through the pathways she had mapped, each failure putting more load on the adjacent sections, until a substantial portion of the 412-kilometer bore was compromised. The tunnel had taken 9 years to build. It was the backbone of the Reach's internal transit system. 200,000 Vekari and approximately 40,000 human workers, contractors, and settled families lived and worked in the population centers it connected. The king was very still while she presented this. His court was also very still, with a quality of stillness she had not seen in the chamber before. Not the formal stillness of protocol, but something closer to the held breath of a creature, realizing that something it had believed was solid was not solid. When she finished, he said, "Your monitors, you installed them without authorization." "Yes." "Because the authorized systems were not detecting what you were finding." "Yes." "I documented the discrepancy in my second report." She pulled up the report on the tablet. The authorized systems were calibrated to VECRE structural tolerance parameters. The tunnel was built to those parameters by human construction crews, but the seams between VECRE-specified materials and human-source materials develop microfracture patterns that require human construction experience baselines to detect. The VECRE monitoring systems weren't designed to look for this category of failure. It's not a flaw in VECRE engineering. It's a translation problem. The king looked at her steadily. A translation problem. The same kind of problem we've been having in general, she said. Between your designs and our construction, between your standards and ours, the tunnel works. It is an extraordinary structure, but the places where it was translated between your vision and our hands, those are the places that need attention. Those are the places your monitoring systems are not looking. She paused. She thought of her father. She thought of 7 reports filed and received and left to settle into some archive where no one would open them until the thing they were warning about had already happened. "I'm not telling you this to cause alarm," she said. "I'm telling you this because it can be fixed. The microfractures can be addressed with a specific sequence of reinforcement work in the central section. I've drafted the remediation plan. It would require approximately 8 months of concurrent bore maintenance work, and it would need to be done by the human crews who built the original seams, because they know the construction vocabulary. But it can be done. The tunnel doesn't have to fail." The king was quiet for a long time. His bioluminescent patterns shifted through several colors she didn't have precise translation for, though she had learned enough to read the general register. Not anger, not dismissal. Something slower and more complex. Calculation. Reassessment. "Why did your reports not reach me?" he said. "I don't know," she said. "I submitted them through the official VECRE Authority intake system. I was informed they were received." The king turned and looked at specific members of his court. She watched 3 of them shift their luminescence to a frequency she could read clearly, the equivalent of a human going pale. "They were received," he said, in a tone that ended several careers silently in that chamber. He looked back at Sira. "Your remediation plan, you have it with you. On the same tablet. You will stay in this chamber and you will walk me through it," he said. "Not through a functionary, not through a translator. You will walk me through it yourself." "Yes," she said, "I can do that." It took 4 hours. She had expected resistance, expected the careful defensive deflections of authority that had met her 7 reports. She did not get them. What she got was a sovereign who had been shielded from an inconvenient truth for long enough that the inconvenient truth had grown into a structural crisis, and who was now, confronted with the data plainly and completely and without anyone able to filter it, simply trying to understand. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. When she didn't know something, she said so and said what she would need to find out. When he pushed on a point that she was certain about, she didn't move, just explained again with different words until he could see what she was seeing. At the end of the 4th hour, he said, "The remediation work." "Yes." "You would lead it." It was not quite a question. She answered it like it wasn't. "I would need to lead the bore crew team for the central section reinforcement work. For the secondary seam work, I'd want to bring in 2 crews who worked the original bore. They know those sections better than anyone. And I'll need direct line reporting access for the duration, because the work is going to surface new data, and I can't be filing reports through a system that may not forward them to you." The sovereign's luminescence shifted to a warm gold. It was the clearest thing she had seen from him. "You are asking for access that bypasses my administrative structure," he said. "I am. Because my administrative structure has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted to pass critical technical information to me in a timely manner." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "Then you negotiated well, engineer. The lineage reclamation process gives a petitioner certain rights of address. You used those rights to bring a case that was legitimate and which you knew would be decided quickly. Then you used the position of address, standing in my chamber, with my attention already given, to present data you had been unable to deliver through proper channels. Yes, she said. This is either very clever or very desperate. Both, she said. The tunnel can fail in 14 months. I've been trying to prevent that for 3 years. I was out of options. He looked at her with the ancient compound attention that 4 centuries of life gave a creature. She met it steadily. My father died in a mine, she said, because 7 reports were filed and not read. I will not watch it happen again. The chamber was very quiet. The light moved in the natural stone of the walls. You will have your access, he said. Davy was waiting outside the diplomatic corridor. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, which was either a profound comment on court protocol or a sign that he'd been waiting long enough that standing had become unreasonable. He looked up when she came out. He read her face the way Boer crew read an instrument panel, quickly, looking for what mattered. Got the ring, he said. She opened her hand. The lunisilver caught the corridor light. He let out a long breath. And the rest? He's going to authorize the remediation work. I'll have direct line reporting access. She closed her fingers around the ring again, feeling its familiar weight. We start planning the Boer team rotation tomorrow. Davy stood up slowly, with the deliberate economy of someone who'd been sitting on a hard floor for 4 hours. Vas. Gone, I don't know where. I don't particularly care. He nodded. They walked together toward the Boer section, through the diplomatic corridor, and then through the transition passage, and then through the heavy pressure doors that separated the court spaces from the working heart of the tunnel. On the other side of those doors, the sound changed, the constant low thrum of the Boer environment, the hum and tick of infrastructure that had been alive for 9 years and that was, if she was right about everything, going to stay alive. 14 months, Davy said. That's not much margin. 8 months of work if we start immediately, which we will. She paused at the corridor junction, oriented herself by the subtle pressure sound that told her where in the tunnel's 412 kilometers she was standing. We need to pull the subsection survey data for the central bore first. I want to do a full physical inspection of segments 110 through 140 before we finalize the reinforcement sequence. Tonight, she thought of her father. She thought of the 7 reports. She thought of the way the microfracture data had looked on the tablet in the Sovereign's chamber, the slow, steady deepening of the cracks in the rock that held everything up. Tonight, she said. The inspection took 16 hours. She and Davy and 3 senior bore technicians walked every meter of the central section, pulling tap readings, checking visual indicators, running manual stress tests on the seam junctions that the automated system had been missing. She had her tablet. She had the remediation plan she'd drafted in the deep maintenance archive over the previous 6 weeks, annotated now with the real-time readings, adjusted for what she was finding. By the end of the 16th hour, she understood the tunnel better than she had understood anything since she was 17 years old, and had spent 4 months learning a failing mind from the inside. Because there was nothing like knowing something was going to break to focus your attention on exactly how it was breaking. The failure mode was not as fast as the worst-case scenario. It was not as slow as the best case. The true timeline, based on what she was finding in the physical inspection, was closer to 12 months than 14. The remediation would be tighter than she'd told the Sovereign. She didn't adjust the schedule she gave the Boer crew. She adjusted the work sequence instead, prioritizing the 3 seam junctions that were closest to critical threshold. If she could stabilize those, the propagation pathway was interrupted and the rest of the timeline expanded. She explained this to the crew at the shift change briefing. They were Boer workers. They understood the tunnel the way she understood it, through their bodies and their hands, and they listened with the focused attention of people who knew they were being told something that mattered. One of them, a woman named Gret, who had worked the central section bore since the first year of construction, asked the question Sira had been waiting for. The Vekari supervisors, are they going to be in our way? The Sovereign has authorized direct line reporting access for the remediation project. Our work orders go through me. I've been given a court liaison for any interdepartmental coordination. Sira looked at the crew. The supervisors who were in the chain of command for the 7 reports I filed are currently having a difficult morning. I don't anticipate their interference. A ripple of something moved through the crew that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite a cheer, but was made of the same material. How long? Grit asked. If we start immediately and maintain the sequence I've laid out, 8 months of continuous work. The tunnel stands. If we don't, she paused. There was no useful way to soften it, and these people would not thank her for trying. It fails within the year, not all at once, in sequence, the way these things always go. No one in the room needed her to say anything else. Right, Gret said, let's start. The remediation work was, in most respects, the hardest thing Sira had ever done. It was also, in a way she hadn't expected, the clearest. Every shift produced data. Every segment they stabilized told her something about the next one. The tunnel, which had been trying to tell her something for 3 years, was now finally being heard, and she understood viscerally, in the way that the bore environment got into you, that structures were not passive. They accumulated history. They expressed it. The job was to listen well enough to read what they were saying before it became a language made entirely of catastrophe. She had direct line access to the Sovereign. She used it precisely the way she'd said she would. Weekly reports, format of a Vekari administrative briefing, data dense, conclusions clearly stated, uncertainties explicitly flagged. He read them. She knew because he occasionally replied, not with lengthy responses, but with single-line questions that told her which part he'd read and what had caught his attention. In the 3rd month, he summoned her to the diplomatic gallery. Not the audience chamber. The gallery, which was a different space, less formal, designed for working conversations rather than protocol. The wall of the gallery was transparent composite that looked out into the tunnel bore itself, and the light through it was the deep amber of the bore environment. And standing in it, she felt the same slight cognitive dissonance she always felt when the court spaces and the working spaces pressed up against each other. The king was standing at the transparent wall, looking into the bore. His court members were not present. The Vekari court liaison, who had been her administrative contact, was in the corner, attending with formal invisibility. Your 3rd monthly report, the king said. You flagged a discrepancy in the segment 120 junction. The reinforcement work there. You noted that the response to the anchoring compounds was different from the modeled prediction. Yes. The rock composition in that area has a higher volatile mineral content than the survey data indicated. We're using a modified anchoring formula that accounts for it. The junction is stable, but the modified formula needs to be documented for future maintenance protocols. Because the original protocols won't work in that section. Not reliably, no. The original protocols were written from the survey data. The survey data had a gap. She paused. There are almost certainly other gaps of that kind throughout the tunnel, not just in that section. The survey methods the Vekari Authority used were excellent, but they had a specific range of resolution. Below that resolution, the kind of local rock composition variation I found in 120 won't show up until someone is working the physical seam. The king looked at the bore through the transparent wall. You are saying there are things about this structure that can only be known by the people who work inside it. Yes. And the people who work inside it have, historically, not had a pathway to bring that knowledge to me. The pathways existed formally, she said. They weren't functioning in practice. He turned from the window. I have been told by my administrative staff that your reports were received, and that they were evaluated, and that they were determined to be insufficiently urgent to warrant escalation. I have not been able to determine who made that determination, because the records of the evaluation process do not appear to have been kept." Sira said nothing. "I want you to understand," he said, "that I am not telling you this as an explanation or as a justification. I am telling you this because you should know the mechanism of the thing that nearly killed my tunnel so that you can help me fix it. Not the seams, the pathway." She looked at him. 400 years old, she thought. 400 years of having a court structure that filtered what reached him. And someone in a gray work uniform had walked into his chamber with a tablet and a legal claim to 3 minutes of his attention and had refused to stop talking. "The pathway problem is harder than the seams," she said. "I know. The seams I can remediate. I can give you a protocol for monitoring them going forward, a set of indicators your systems can actually read, documentation that survives the specific translation problem between Vekari calibration standards and human construction vocabulary." She thought about how to say the next part. "The pathway problem is about whether the people closest to the work have a way to reach the people who need to know. That's not an engineering problem. That's a different kind of problem." "A governance problem," he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very direct for someone in your position." "I've been direct for 3 years, and the only time it worked was when I walked into your chamber with a stolen ring and a legal claim on 3 minutes of your time." She paused. "I don't think directness was the problem. I think I didn't have access. I think the pathway was blocked." "Yes," he said, "it was." He turned back toward the boar. "You have my direct access. Keep it. When the remediation is complete, I want a formal proposal for a monitoring protocol, one that your boar crews can use, one that generates data in the format that my administrative system can process, and one that has a direct escalation pathway to me, not through administrative review. Directly. I can write that." "I know you can." He looked at the ring on her hand. She had strung it on a thin cable and worn it around her wrist since the audience chamber, the way her mother had worn it before she'd made it into a bonding ring, back when it was just a piece of Callisto ore she'd sieved from the ice. "Your family built things," he said. "My family worked rock," she said. "Whatever was inside it was what it was. You just had to know how to look." The remediation was completed in 7 months and 19 days. The final seam junction, the one in segment 138, which had been the deepest and the most complex, the one where the Vekari design and the human construction had spoken the most different languages to each other, was stabilized on a morning shift by Gret and 2 of her crew, using the modified anchoring compound that Sira had reformulated in the 3rd month. Sira was there for it. She pulled the final tap reading herself. The number was within tolerance, the seam was stable, the propagation pathway was interrupted. She stood in the deep central section of the tunnel, in the amber light of the bore, in the heat, and the smell of processed rock and machinery and human sweat, and she held the reading in her hand, and she breathed. "In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The tunnel breathed around her the deep subsonic thrum, the tick and settle, the faint heartbeat of the ventilation system she had designed, and that ran so smoothly still that most people had stopped noticing it existed. She noticed it. She noticed it every time. Davy appeared at her elbow. She showed him the reading. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he let out a breath that sounded like something he'd been holding for 7 months and 19 days. "That's the one," he said. "That's the one." They stood there for a while in the deep quiet of the working bore, surrounded by the tunnel that had been trying to tell them something for 3 years, and that was, now, finally, not in danger of saying it catastrophically. Gret came over and looked at the reading. She made a sound that wasn't a word. She went back to her crew and said something, and they made sounds that also weren't words, but that meant the same thing. Sira put the tap reader away. She put her hand over the ring on her wrist, the lunisilver warm against her palm, the frozen starlight of the lunacite catching the boar light and making something small and cold and beautiful in the dark. "Come on," she said. "We've got the monitoring protocol to write." The formal monitoring protocol was 47 pages in the Vekari administrative format and 22 pages in the human documentation format, and it included a direct escalation pathway to the sovereign that was the first such pathway ever written into official Concordat engineering documentation. It also included, in an appendix that Sira added without being asked, a translation guide, not a language translation, a systems translation, a reference document explaining in terms that both Vekari administrators and human boar workers could read, how the two calibration vocabularies related to each other, where they diverged, and what kinds of failure could occur in the gap between them. The appendix was called simply the seams. The sovereign read it. She knew because he sent her a single-line reply. It said, in Vekari formal register, this should have existed from the beginning of the project. She wrote back in the same register, yes, it should have, now it does. 18 months after she had walked into the sovereign audience chamber with her tablet and her legal claim and her 3 minutes of formal access, Sira was standing in the diplomatic gallery, the working one, with the transparent wall, when the court liaison found her and told her that the sovereign would like to speak with her. She had been reviewing boar maintenance schedules. She saved her work and followed the liaison. In the gallery, the king was not looking at the boar. He was looking at her mother's ring, which she still wore on its cable around her wrist, because she had not yet decided whether to wear it on her finger or to keep it where she could feel it, and she had found that the not deciding was itself a kind of answer. The Concordat Authority has requested a review of the tunnel's monitoring protocols, he said. They want to extend the model to the other 4 infrastructure projects currently under joint construction in the Reach. She waited. "I told them," he said, "that I would ask you whether you were willing to lead the review." She thought about what that meant. She thought about 4 other tunnels, 4 other sets of seams between Vekari design and human construction, 4 other boar crews whose reports might or might not be reaching the people who needed to read them. She thought about her father, who had filed 3 reports and died in Section 14. She thought about the tunnel, which had been trying to tell someone something for 3 years, and the 14 months that had become 7 months and 19 days because someone had finally listened. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." The sovereign's luminescence shifted to the warm gold she had learned to recognize. He looked at her ring one more time. "Your mother made that," he said. It was not a question. He had read the bond ceremony documentation she had submitted as part of the lineage reclamation process. "From ore she sieved herself," Sira said. "She said there was no point in wearing something beautiful if you hadn't made it from something real." The king considered this for a long time, with the slow patience of 4 centuries. "A useful philosophy," he said, "for builders." Sira looked at the ring on her wrist, the lunisilver, the frozen starlight of the lunacite. Her mother's hands and the ice, and the mine that was named for the moon. "Yes," she said, "it is."